This is Coach Colette, welcoming you to another episode of Let's Talk. How would you define yourself? What labels might you use to describe yourself? These are a couple of the questions that were posed during this episode of Let's Talk on identity and mental health. We were in part inspired by the fact that this is Minority Mental Health Month, and Mental Health America has a hashtag called Depth of My Identity because they are seeking to expand the definition of minority to include more marginalized and underserved groups. And this relates to intersectionality also, which is how different forms of discrimination can combine or intersect or overlap and then affect different marginalized groups. So what does this have to do with mental health? Well, this is what we talk about. We also talked about how perceptions of others impact your mental health. So as a Black woman, as a Black female entrepreneur, as a coach, as a facilitator, as a daughter, as a woman, there are all sorts of labels that I can assign to myself. And I define my identity on a lot of different levels. And it's only been recently that I have started to think about this because as the national conversation grows around it, I've realized that those different aspects of my identity are important to me. And I've noticed that people's perceptions of me based on those identities has impacted me differently throughout my life. So these are some of the things that we talk about. It's me and my Start Within team, and it's another candid conversation. So I hope that you are inspired and motivated to think about your own identity and also to think about how some of these aspects have impacted your mental health. Stay tuned until the end because we also do share our thoughts and tips on ways that you can support your mental health, which we definitely think is something that is very important. So get ready and listen up.
July was designated as Minority Mental Health Awareness Month back in 2008 to bring awareness to the unique struggles that underrepresented groups face in regard to mental illness in the United States. Today I have with me the Start Within team. I'm Samaya.
I'm Wendy. I'm Candace.
And Colette here. So today we will discuss how identities have impacted our mental health. So to start the discussion off, what labels would you use to describe yourself?
I would describe myself as Chinese American and a college student, and I'm also first generation.
Yeah, I think I'd say first generation Korean American, college student, probably say female, she, her.
I am an African American woman. I am an entrepreneur. I am an only child. I could keep going, and I'm sure we'll talk more about it. How about you?
I would describe myself as being a woman, a Muslim, Somali, a friend, daughter, sister. But I often feel like, how we choose to label ourselves becomes like an adamant part of who we are, but sometimes we don't always get the luxury to choose. Very often our existence is defined by the labels society places on us, which leads me to our next question. How have the perceptions of others impacted you and your mental health?
For me, I don't like to talk about my failures. So whenever I don't get something I wanted or I fail at something, I don't like to really talk about it to people because I don't want to spread that kind of negativity. And because that's the way I am, I don't like to share negativity. People perceive me as somebody who's always happy, who always gets what she wants, or like whenever she tries to get something, she always gets it. So that kind of perception is really hard on me sometimes, because just because I don't talk about certain things, it doesn't mean it doesn't happen. People have this perception that I get everything I want because I don't talk about times when I don't get what I want, because I don't want them to see me that way, or I don't like sharing my struggles with other people.
What do you think? Why do you think that is, or have you thought about that?
I usually talk about things that stress me out or things that make me upset with my parents, not really my friends. Although I do rely on my friends for like emotional support, I don't like to bring them down from like the stresses that I'm feeling. So I usually share that with my parents because I feel a stronger bond with them in that way. So sometimes people don't really understand like different things I share with different people.
Yeah, I can relate to that a lot because I feel like a lot of times, same as you, like a lot of times I'm more on the receiving side. So I guess people would perceive me as being, oh, you're a really good listener, you're really easy to talk to, and you're really nice and really caring. And that's great things to be labeled and to be perceived as someone who is like that. But I feel like everyone has days, or there's days where I'm a little annoyed at everything. I just like kind of want to sleep. I needed more sleep, or I'm hungry and I'm like hangry or something's off. That I kind of just like, maybe I don't really have the energy to listen to all of that, but I keep feeling like even if I don't want to, I kind of still have to, because the second I'm a little less enthusiastic or a little less caring, it's like, oh, is something wrong with you today? Did something happen? And it's kind of that kind of pressure to keep up what other people perceive you as, even though it should be perfectly okay not to.
I think the perceptions that people have of you is a two-sided coin. So there's like the positive perceptions and then there's the negative ones. Either way, I feel like they do have an impact on my mental health. So like Wendy said, being known as either like super outgoing or like a strong person or that friend that everyone can like rely on is very hard for you when you are in like a very dark moment or you are going through depression and anxiety. It's like in a sense of if you do show that vulnerability, you're no longer perceived as like that strong friend or that person that people can rely on. And so you feel like you don't really have that space or that outlet to show that side of you. And that's how I feel like that perception is necessarily positive, but is negative towards like your mental health. And then in the negative sense, I feel like with the labels, like I said, that people define you as, can have a negative perception on like their mental health. So depending on which labels, for instance, like if you're a woman, having like the perception of she's emotional is like that can have a negative impact on your mental health, because every time you do feel a certain type of way, you can't really share that or you can't express that because you feel like you're perpetuating that label or you're kind of like feeding into that stereotype in a sense.
Yeah, I think for me as a coach, there's the professional side, and then there's also, as me as a Black woman, the personal side. And I've actually had conversations on this podcast. I did a podcast about the strong Black woman stereotype, and I feel like that is often the case that as a Black woman, right, it's like, oh, you're holding it all down, you don't really need help, you've got this all under control. And I think for me, so that's the personal side, and then being a coach and an entrepreneur, right? I'm the coach, I'm the person that holds space for everyone. I do the circles, I do all of these things. So I find for me the challenge is, right, where are the safe spaces where I can be like, yeah, I had a crappy day, or I'm hangry, or I'm sleepy, or that deal didn't go through, and where can I share that honestly and not have it reflect on like what I do, right? Like me having that moment does not mean that I can't be your coach or I can't be a facilitator or I can't do these other things. And I feel like I can tell, and it's interesting because no one necessarily says it, right? No one necessarily says anything, but sometimes I have that feeling of like, oh wow, is someone forming an opinion about me based on that one moment in time, versus like who I am as a person. I think it's interesting because I know this is part of this Minority Mental Health Month. The depth of my identity, right, was what is the theme. And so I think it is interesting, at least for me, to think about also, right, what are the perceptions of a particular, whether, like you said, female, emotional, or a particular ethnic group or race or other things, or young people, old people, right? Like there are different perceptions that people have of others that have nothing to do with you as who you are, but have to do with the category that they have put you in. Has anyone had like that experience where you feel like, oh, someone was judging me not on me, but what they either saw or perceived?
Yeah, I think on like a broad scale, one of the most common kind of stereotypes for Asian people would be, oh, you're really like you're good at math, you're good at science, and I think especially, I don't know if it might not apply to every single Asian person, but for me personally, it creates kind of that divide of like, on one hand, I get defensive of like, that's a stereotype. I don't have to be good at math. Like, what if I'm not? Like, it should be okay for me not to. But then on the other hand, it kind of develops a kind of like stubbornness to want to be good, to live up to that stereotype and show them that because it kind of feels like if I'm wrong, if I'm not good at math, then it kind of becomes like, oh, why aren't you? So to kind of deflect that, it makes me want to be and try to be, like, match that stereotype. But on the other hand, I don't want to play into it. Mm-hmm. So it kind of creates that struggle.
Mm-hmm. I can relate to that in the Asian stereotype, and that career-wise, it feels like you were brought up to fulfill certain stereotypes of careers that you're supposed to pursue. So when I was younger, I thought, oh, maybe I'm going to be a doctor or some kind of scientist or engineer. But slowly my interests started to change, and I realized that I was more interested in the business side, and not that many people in my family did business or consulting or any finance related industry. So that was a struggle in itself, because not only am I breaking that kind of stereotype, but there's nobody to really look up to, because I can't speak for all families, but my family didn't really have that kind of route, I guess. So speaking to those kinds of stereotypes is really hard, but you just have to kind of find your own way and be okay with not fulfilling what other people think about you.
More often, I feel like the labels that like I identify with become like the elephant in the room every time I walk in, because I'm always usually the only Muslim person, the only Black person, or the only woman that encompasses those two identities. And so I feel as if I'm always categorized and put into this like either like danger, like stay away from her in a sense, or in a sense of I become that token person. So I have to sit here and speak on all of those identities. And more times, it's like any topic comes up that is happening in the world, and all eyes are on me to speak on it. So I feel like continuously I have to uphold this certain image of myself, where I have to be the best possible version of myself, because suddenly I'm representing all of those huge identities. And so I feel like that is a huge weight on my shoulders, and that has in fact affected my mental health over the years. But in a sense, I try to take a positive sense to it, because like I am Black, I am Muslim, I am a woman. And so I would rather encompass those like that positive attributes, because people very rarely come across people like me in a sense. Like they only see me on TV, or rarely actually do they see me on TV. It's always like they see me or see representations of who I am on the news, and that always has like a negative connotation towards it. So in real life, when people do meet someone like me, it's like I have to be that best possible version of myself, just to sit here and say like, not all of us in a sense we're not all bad.
Sometimes, like, this might diverge a little bit, but sometimes I get kind of surprised by how much people base their opinions of people on the news. Like, I get it on one hand because it is what you're seeing on the media. It's what you're seeing, and that's what you're getting. But on the other hand, it's the news. There's a reason why it's on there. It's the news because it's something shocking. It's something that needs to be shared. Like, you don't put daily life on the news. You put things that are newsworthy on the news. Those are the outliers. So to think that people use that as their basis to form their opinions on like entire nationalities, entire countries, based off what they see on what is the headline, sometimes it just amazes me.
Yeah. I mean, well, right, back in the day, they used to say, like, if it bleeds, it leads, right? Because it was this aspect of sensationalism. I think there's news, and then there's also media, there's entertainment, too, so whether it's TV or movies, and, like, the lack of diversity in those forms, and including the news, right? Like, whether or not you grew up seeing someone who looked like you reporting the news, right? Not just being the subject of the news, but did you see someone reporting the news or being in a movie or being on a TV show, right? Like we can't minimize the impact that has on our perceptions of how people are or what we think of them. To Samaya's point, I think I definitely have also had that experience of being the only woman or the only person of color in a room, and I feel like I almost want to say flip the script. Like I can't say that I'm not aware of how I'm perceived or what might be going through someone's mind when I do walk in, but I walk in like I own that room anyway, and that has just come over time. And I guess in some ways it maybe started as a defense, but now it's become just who I am. Like I walk in, I mean, I do facilitation, I go around the country, right? I go to places where, right, people aren't necessarily expecting a Black woman to be their facilitator. And then there I am. And I launch into the content, like, and this is what we're going to do. And so it's that sense of, for me, it's a way of staying grounded in myself. And then if someone else has a problem with that, well, that really doesn't have anything to do with me. And I think, at least on a professional setting, that's easier or somewhat easier. Sometimes, I guess, on a personal situation, right? Like say you go with someone or you go to a certain neighborhood, like I might go somewhere and be like, oh, I'll be sitting in a restaurant or in a bar or whatever, and I'm the only person of color or I'm the only Black woman in the room, right? It'll depend on how the vibe feels. Like I'm very also big on energy. Like, does the energy feel good, or do I feel like I'm uncomfortable and maybe I don't want to be in this situation? So I think, because I guess in today's day and age, we can't minimize personal safety, right? We need to make sure that we do feel safe. Much as I don't like to say that, like I don't like to say that I want to feel scared or feel, like being somewhere that makes me uncomfortable, but I also have to be realistic about, particularly if I'm by myself, like where am I, who's around me, and does this seem like a safe environment?
Hi, it's Coach Colette. I hope that you are enjoying this episode of Let's Talk. I wanted to share some information about a healing technique that you hear me mention in my episodes. It's EFT, or Emotional Freedom Technique. It's also known as tapping because you are tapping on acupuncture points on your body. Why is this important? Because it can help you to reduce stress or anxiety. It's also really helpful to rewrite those limiting beliefs that you may still be carrying from previous traumatic experiences, even things like microaggressions. I can help you with that. Go to my website, startwithincoaching.com, and at the top, click on Book Online. Scroll until you'll see Reset Your Mindset with EFT, and you can book a private virtual session with me. I'll teach you what all the tapping points are, and we'll spend the session beginning to unravel and rewrite those limiting beliefs. Startwithincoaching.com, book online, and book your private EFT session so we can release and let go of those limiting beliefs.
So, moving on to our next question. How would you say that you guys have encountered stigma as a person of color within your community?
I think for me, my family, like I of course at school in our health class and maybe touch on it a little bit, not really not until college, but within my family, it was never brought up. Like we didn't really, it's not necessarily in my family, not necessarily like directed badly, but it was just never, it was assumed to never be an issue, never to be something that really would happen unless a traumatic event occurred. So we never talked about it. It wasn't necessarily until later in life, like my mom, she struggles with insomnia and she takes medication for it. So she, of course, would talk about like, if I talk to her about like, oh, I'm overthinking things, and that didn't happen until college. I started opening it up to her about things like that, and then she would say, "Oh, it's because you're like me and like my family, like my side of the family. Those kind of things run. Like we tend to think a lot, but it was never addressed as necessarily something like a mental health issue. It was just a diagnosis like insomnia. You have it. It's something that runs in the family. So it's never kind of. It was just assumed not to be an issue."
I can relate to that a lot because in my household, we don't talk about mental health as being something like a problem. My parents usually focus on more physical problems like your actual like health according to your body, not really according to your mind, because they kind of assume that, well, if you're working too hard and you're getting stressed out because you're working too hard, you should stop working so hard. But then they also have the expectation that you should get good grades and you should stay on top of your game, but then they also don't equate staying on top of your game with also hard work, because those two go hand in hand, and it's really hard to keep a good balance, but then not having them give their kids like a way to protect their mental health because it's not really talked about in the family. And it's interesting because it makes me wonder, is it because my parents never experienced it themselves, like having a mental health issue, and is that why that they don't really talk about it with me? I think I consider myself not to struggle with mental health because I take breaks and I understand when's my limit, and whenever I feel like I'm at the limit where I'm really stressed out, I always do something about it. Like I take a break and I go watch funny YouTube videos, and I just go talk to my friends or like go hang out. Like I take a break from it, which I think really helped me in maintaining that balance in my life, which I really like recommend to other people too. Like you don't have to feel like you have to continue running on this treadmill. Like you don't have to keep going. You can actually take a break and it's totally fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'd say in my family, we didn't talk about mental health specifically. Like when I can think of, like I know that hypertension or high blood pressure runs in the family. I know that diabetes runs on one side of my father's family. But right, we don't talk, about so-and-so had a breakdown or so-and-so had an issue with mental health. Like as I sit here, I can't even recall ever having that conversation. And, I think what's also interesting as people age, right, like we talk about sort of we are different generations, but sort of like, whether younger being in school or sort of like, mid-career. And then there's also as people age, right, like I've heard a couple of comments that have been made, by older folks, and it's like, wow, don't even think about like depression and end of life and how that can cause anxiety and concern. So I think it is interesting that at our various stages of life, there are, issues and concerns to think about for mental health. I wouldn't say that there was a particular stigma against it, but it seems like to be this thing that just wasn't talked about. And so when I started doing, stress management and became a certified stress management coach, my parents know what I do, and we'll talk about it, I guess, again, sort of still from the professional level, but not necessarily specifically into like, how are you feeling about certain things? And part of that is also probably me. I'm private, so like you're saying, like I'm probably opposite of you, Wendy, where I don't necessarily open up to my parents about everything. So that, I guess, is also part of it too, right? Like, how much do we share with people within our families versus that we share with professionals or that we share with friends? But I know that in the African American community, at least, there are some stigmas around mental health, and there are all the slang terms, which I guess go across other ethnicities as well. Like, well, if you call someone cray cray, like they're just right. So like we have these sort of derogatory statements, or but we don't necessarily talk about what are the challenges, the real challenges, and speak about it in ways that people can feel safe about bringing what's going on with them.
I would say there's a huge stigma around the community that I come from. Mm-hmm. And so in 1991, there was a civil war that broke out in Somalia. And a lot of people were affected from the civil war and a huge population migrated to Minnesota. And most people were affected with PTSD, depression, anxiety, to migrate from your country into a new one and leave everything behind and see your home destroyed, and everything has a huge impact on your mental health. And so I feel like a lot of people had to sit here and assimilate, so they couldn't deal with their issues up front. And so it passed on generational. And then suddenly, like, their kids are seeing like these signs and they can't necessarily like recognize it, but then they start to see it within themselves. And as like they grow older, they recognize that as being depression and anxiety and PTSD. And because of the fact that they grew up watching their parents never necessarily deal with it right away, they don't know how to deal with it themselves. And most times, like, elders within the Somali community never faced it because they have this mistrust with like healthcare, like professionals. And there goes like the stigma within that. And then they try to sit here and implement religion with mental health, where they would try to pray the sad away. And that never really works because it's not something like, yeah, granted, like prayer will work and everything, but this is like a chemical imbalance in your brain. So you do need professional help. And so I feel like when it comes to me personally, I never dealt with like my mental illnesses right away because I didn't feel like I had the right outlets, and I didn't know which way or how to deal with it. And I felt like as an adult was when I started to recognize the huge stigma around my community. But I would say, like, on a positive note, that throughout the years, the youth have started to recognize it and are trying to implement ways to, kind of go like head on and deal with these mental illnesses. And, kind of sitting here and talking about it is a huge way to combat this too. And keeping like that conversation going of, like, it's okay to sit here and deal with depression. It is okay to sit here and deal with anxiety. That doesn't mean you're weak. That doesn't mean that you're less than. Like, you are still who you are, but you are who you are dealing with like these mental illnesses.
Yeah, I would say it's similar in African American communities. I think because another aspect to what we're talking about, or maybe underlying some of this, when we think of things like institutionalized racism or things like that people encountered. And it is interesting. So when you think generations of people, African Americans here in this country, going back and sort of thinking about what you were allowed to say, or how you were allowed to say it, or who you could talk to, or who you couldn't talk to, or where you could sit, or where you couldn't sit, right? All of these things that then get internalized, whether it was your grandmother or your mother or your father, and then having reactions to things and not knowing where they come from. So, for example, I have done EFT, emotional freedom technique, or tapping workshops with primarily groups of, say, African Americans or other people of color. And when we do group sessions, like, all sort of, although I think in this group we could all probably relate to it. Like, I remember we were doing a tapping session, and I was like, one of the statements that came to mind to tap around was, you'll always have to be twice as good in order to succeed. And everybody was like, oh my God, like, we have these things that are coming through us and we don't even know where they come from, but it is based in history. And so there's that sense of, how do we do the intergenerational healing, like you're saying, so creating spaces where younger generations are able to feel comfortable, and then also supporting our elders, because you're right, yeah, they didn't get to talk back, if you will, whatever you want to call it, or then if they had experiences, then they might bring that home, and then that gets projected onto the kids, and that falls through generations. So I think there are lots of ways now with these kinds of conversations that we can begin to heal. And there is the adage, right, like once you heal one person, we are actually kind of healing many of us.
Yeah, I think definitely nowadays in current generations, thanks to like either globalization and like internet and just a wider access to more resources, like there's apps to help you with meditation now. Like the younger generation is definitely given more opportunity to actually understand and deal with and have this conversation. But I definitely feel like if you follow the stigmas, and at least in like the Korean community or Korean American community, as I kind of said before, it's either not addressed because it's just seen as not being a thing. Like mental illness isn't really a huge illness, or it's just a side effect of a physical illness, or like they focus more on the symptoms that you show, like your behaviors that may be from the mental illness. Like if you're going through depression and you're acting a certain way, the focus is more on why are you acting that way rather than what might be going on inside. And so I guess like the more common thing, at least until like maybe 10 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, would be give you the antidepressants to be just not necessarily to get you through therapy and to help you through it, but because you're acting differently and you need to like get back to quote unquote yourself. But I'm thankfully now the discussion is more open and it is being recognized as something that is real. But before that, it was just seen as mental illness just isn't really a thing.
I think it's great that we're talking about mental awareness, especially in this generation, because it gives me more confidence that following this generation, it's going to be more talked about and it's going to be made more obvious to future generations. And now it's not something we hide necessarily, but something to address and not be the elephant in the room. Because I know that for me, the generations after me are going to be more comfortable talking about how they feel, or the stresses or anxieties or the depression that they may feel from things that happen in life, and it's not something that they have to hide from the people in their life. So it's great that we're having this kind of conversation in this time.
So going off of that, what advice would you give to others to protect their well-being and overall mental health if they encounter similar challenges?
For me, I would say to know your own limits and your own boundaries. How far can you push yourself and actually be able to control yourself, and when is your tipping point? I feel it's really important to explore yourself in that you have to know what's the difference between being stressed out versus having anxiety. Because having a healthy amount of stress is good for you. It pushes you to be a better person. But if you push it too far, then that's where the problem stems. So I think exploring and understanding yourself, starting from within, and understanding how much you can take without like harming your own mental health. And also I would say to find your own outlets. What makes you feel like, how do you get rid of stress? For me, it's to watch something funny. Like for me, laughter is really important. It's something that really helps me get over the stress that I have, even from schoolwork or from personal life. If I can find something to laugh about, that's like my own kind of medicine. So I'd say know your own boundaries and what helps to relieve stress.
Yeah, I think similar to that, I would say try not to compare your like where you are now and maybe your progress towards your mental health. If you do start trying to work on it, like don't compare your progress to someone else's or how their coping methods with yours. And maybe it works for them, and maybe it seems like they're doing really well and you want to try it. It's fine to try it. Like that being said, don't be like, oh, that might not work for me, and just don't try it. Just try. You can try different things because you never know what will work for you. Just once you try it, have faith in it and trust in it, even if it's not necessarily it's not going to happen in one snap. Like, it's not like the next day you're going to wake up and suddenly be free. Like, there's going to be days where it hits back full force, or days where you're like, okay, yeah, I'm good today. And that's totally fine, because there's a day where you feel suddenly back to square one. That doesn't mean you're back at square one, because each day is a step in the right direction. And I would also say, I guess this is my coping method, is to block out a specific time to schedule, actually put in my schedule a specific block of time that I call me time, where I can use it, if I want, I can use it to study, or I can use it to hang out with friends, or I can just use it to be by myself. And if someone asks me, hey, can you do this for me? I can with confidence say, I'm sorry, I have something to do then, and be without guilt and know that that time is for me.
That's awesome. I love that. I'm going to go on the if you do seek help side of this, because I want to connect it back to what we were talking about earlier, which is the theme of our different identities. And so I feel like finding support, care, resources that support your various identities. We usually say that as culturally competent, but I feel like it's not just culturally competent, right? Because identity goes across many different paradigms. So whether that's gender, race, ethnicity, religion, orientation, all of those things. So when you're looking for that kind of support for your mental health and well-being, ensuring that the resources and or the people, the coach, the counselor, the therapist, is aware of your identities, and so making sure that conversation or that support doesn't then really make you feel worse because that person isn't aware, right? You're walking in saying, I got stressed because of a microaggression at work, and they don't know what microaggression is, right? Like, so then that might make you feel like, oh, now you feel like, well, maybe it's me and I made that up, and right? So the care and the support also needs to be able to hold space for all of your identities. I think that's really important, and I agree with what's been said so far.
I would say my piece of advice to others facing similar challenges would be find someone to speak to, whether that's professionally or someone within like your inner circle that is able to just simply listen and empathize with the issues that you face. It's okay to talk about the things that you go through. And then I would also, I guess, backpack off of everyone and say, like, finding that healthy outlet to express yourself, because sometimes you are too scared to be vulnerable. So it's okay to be vulnerable through your poetry, your art, any forms of way that, I guess, in a sense that allows you to demonstrate what you're feeling.
Fantastic. Well, I'm excited that we had another conversation for Let's Talk, and I hope that everyone listening got some tips and ideas from this episode, and look forward to our next conversation. And until then, this is Coach Colette helping you to start within to finish strong.